The United States government currently owes $38 trillion, and if you're a regular person trying to understand how the government could possibly pay back that much money, the answer is they can't and they won't. But what's happening right now is even more interesting than default. The US government is erasing $38 trillion in debt using a mechanism that requires no vote in Congress, no approval from taxpayers, and no permission from creditors. And this is happening quietly while media covers culture wars and political drama. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the Federal Reserve and Treasury are making $38 trillion in debt functionally disappear, why this method works better than actually paying the debt or declaring bankruptcy, who loses money when debt gets erased this way, and why they can't stop it, and most importantly, what this means for your savings, your retirement, and your purchasing power over the next decade. Because when a government erases debt without paying it back, someone has to absorb that loss, and that someone is you. So if you want to understand the single biggest financial event happening in America right now, the event that will determine whether your money maintains value or gets destroyed, then pay close attention, because very few people understand this mechanism, and the ones who do understand it are using that knowledge to protect themselves while everyone else gets quietly robbed. Before we explain how the US is erasing $38 trillion in debt, we need to understand how government debt actually works, because most people think of government debt like personal debt, as if the US government borrowed money and now has to pay it back with interest the way you'd pay back a credit card. But government debt, especially debt denominated in a currency you control, works completely differently, and understanding this difference is the key to understanding how debt can be erased without being paid. When the US government spends more than it collects in taxes, which happens almost every year, it covers the difference by issuing treasury bonds. These are IOUs that promise to pay back the borrowed amount plus interest at a specific future date. And investors buy these bonds because they're considered the safest investment in the world, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Currently, the US government has issued $38 trillion worth of these bonds. Some mature in 3 months, some in 2 years, some in 10 years, and some in 30 years. And the government pays interest on all of them, currently about $1 trillion per year just in interest payments, which is larger than the entire defense budget. Now here's what most people don't understand. When those bonds mature, when the government has to pay back the principal, it doesn't actually pay back the money. Instead, it issues new bonds to pay off the old bonds. This is called rolling over the debt. So if you bought a 10-year Treasury bond in 2014 for $10,000, when it matured in 2024, the government didn't give you $10,000 from tax revenue. Instead, it borrowed $10,000 from someone else by issuing a new bond and used that money to pay you. The total debt never goes down through this mechanism. It only goes up because every time the government rolls over debt, it typically borrows even more to cover the deficit that occurred during that period. This creates a mathematical problem. If the debt is $38 trillion today and growing by $2 trillion per year through deficits, and if the government never actually pays down the principal but just keeps rolling it over, then eventually the debt will reach a level where just the interest payments consume all tax revenue, at which point the government either has to default by refusing to pay, or it has to find another way to make the debt problem go away. And that other way is what we're going to explain now. Here's the mechanism the US is using to erase $38 trillion in debt without actually paying it back or defaulting. And it's so clever that most people don't realize it's happening until after their savings have been destroyed. The mechanism is inflation combined with financial repression. And here's how it works, step by step. First, the Federal Reserve creates new money. They do this by purchasing government bonds with money that didn't exist before. This is called quantitative easing, or QE. Between 2008 and 2022, the Fed created $9 trillion this way. They bought $9 trillion in treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities by simply crediting bank accounts with new digital dollars. No taxes were collected to get this money. No gold was sold. No assets were liquidated. The money was just created. And this new money enters the economy through banks and financial markets and eventually causes prices to rise. Second, when prices rise across the economy, this is inflation. The purchasing power of every existing dollar decreases. If you had $10,000 in a savings account, and inflation is 7% per year, After 1 year, your $10,000 can only buy what $9,300 could buy before. You didn't lose any nominal dollars. The number in your account still says 10,000, but you lost $700 in real purchasing power. And this happens to everyone holding dollars, including holders of government bonds. Third, here's the critical part. When the government borrowed money by issuing a bond, let's say a 30-year bond issued in 1994 for $10,000, that bond promised to pay back $10,000 in 2024, and the government will pay back exactly $10,000. It will keep its nominal promise. But if inflation averaged 4% per year over those 30 years, then the $10,000 paid back in 2024 can only buy what $3,100 could buy in 1994. So the government borrowed the equivalent of $10,000 in real purchasing power and paid back the equivalent of $3,100 in real purchasing power. It erased 69% of the debt in real terms, and this happened automatically, without any vote, without any negotiation with creditors. The bondholder got paid back exactly what was promised in nominal terms, so there's no legal default, but in real terms they got robbed of 69%. This is how the US erased most of the debt from World War II. In 1946, the US debt was 120% of GDP. By 1974, it was 30% of GDP, and this didn't happen because the government ran surpluses and paid down the debt. It happened because GDP grew and inflation reduced the real value of the debt. The nominal debt number stayed high, but became insignificant compared to the size of the economy. Let me show you the exact numbers of how much debt the US has already erased using this method and how much more they plan to erase. In 2008, the US national debt was $10 trillion. Today, it's $38 trillion. So the debt increased by $28 trillion in 16 years. Now you might think this means the debt problem got $28 trillion worse, but in real terms it didn't, because during the same period, the dollar lost significant purchasing power through inflation. Let's calculate the real burden. If we adjust the 2008 debt of $10 trillion for inflation to today's dollars, using the CPI, that $10 trillion in 2008 is equivalent to about $14 trillion in 2024 purchasing power. So, in real terms, the debt burden increased from $14 trillion to $38 trillion. That's a real increase of $24 trillion, not $28 trillion. Which means $4 trillion of the nominal increase was just inflation making the old debt number look bigger without actually increasing the real burden. This is the first level of how inflation helps. But here's the more important calculation, the debt to GDP ratio. In 2008, US GDP was $14 trillion and debt was $10 trillion, so debt was 71% of GDP. Today GDP is $28 trillion and debt is $38 trillion. So debt is 136% of GDP. This looks worse. Debt grew faster than the economy. But here's what matters for whether the debt is sustainable. The government's ability to service the debt depends on tax revenue, and tax revenue grows with nominal GDP, not real GDP. If inflation is 5% and real economic growth is 2%, then nominal GDP grows 7%, and tax revenue grows approximately 7%. Which means the government's ability to pay interest on debt grows 7%. Meanwhile, the debt itself, the principal amount, stays fixed in nominal terms. So if the debt is $38 trillion today and stays $38 trillion in nominal terms, but nominal GDP grows 7% per year, then after 10 years GDP will have doubled, which means the debt to GDP ratio will have been cut in half, from 136% to 68%. Without paying back a single dollar of principal. This is the magic trick. Keep the debt number the same in nominal terms while inflating away its real burden by growing nominal GDP. And nominal GDP growth comes from inflation plus real growth, so the higher inflation is, the faster the debt burden shrinks in relative terms. And this is why the Fed and Treasury actually want inflation, despite their public statements about fighting it, because inflation is the only politically feasible way to erase $38 trillion in debt. What would you do if you realize that the government's plan for dealing with $38 trillion in debt is to deliberately destroy the purchasing power of the dollar, that every time you hear about inflation being a problem the government is trying to fix, the reality is, inflation is the solution the government is using, and that your savings account and any bonds you hold, and your fixed income, and your salary, if it doesn't keep up with inflation, are all being systematically devalued to solve a debt problem you didn't create. This is the uncomfortable truth about how sovereign debt works. The government can erase debt by erasing the value of money, and there's nothing creditors can do about it as long as the debt is denominated in a currency the government controls. If you're starting to understand that inflation isn't just an economic phenomenon that happens randomly, but is actually a deliberate policy tool being used to erase $38 trillion in government debt, and that this transfer of wealth from savers and creditors to the government happens without any vote or consent, then you need to subscribe right now, because this channel is one of the very few places explaining how the monetary system actually works, rather than how economics textbooks say it works. Most financial media won't tell you this clearly, because their advertisers are banks and financial institutions who benefit from you not understanding how money works, and mainstream economics pretends that inflation is always bad and something the Fed fights against, when in reality, moderate inflation is the Fed's primary tool for managing unpayable debt. So click subscribe, turn on notifications, because we're going to keep exposing how the system works and how you can protect yourself. And understanding this is worth far more than any financial advice you'll get from traditional sources, because once you understand the mechanism, you can position yourself on the right side of the wealth transfer instead of being the victim of it. Here's the second part of the debt erasure mechanism, and this one is even more insidious than inflation. It's called financial repression, and it means forcing savers to accept returns lower than inflation so that their wealth is systematically transferred to the government. Financial repression works like this. Imagine inflation is running at 7% per year, meaning prices are rising 7%. In a free market, interest rates would rise to compensate savers for this loss of purchasing power. If you're going to lend money for 10 years while inflation is 7% per year, you'd want to earn at least 7% interest just to break even in real terms, plus maybe another 3% as actual profit. So you'd demand 10% interest, but the government can't afford to pay 10% interest on $38 trillion in debt. That would be $3.8 trillion per year in interest payments, which is more than all tax revenue. So instead, the government suppresses interest rates artificially. The Federal Reserve keeps rates low by buying bonds, which increases demand and pushes yields down. And through regulatory pressure, banks and pension funds and insurance companies are required or incentivized to hold government bonds even when those bonds pay negative real returns. So what happens is, inflation runs at 7% while Treasury bonds pay 3%. This means anyone holding those bonds is losing 4% per year in purchasing power. This is a negative real interest rate, and this transfers wealth from bondholders to the government, because the government is borrowing at 3% while the real cost of that debt is being eroded at 7%. The net effect is the government is being paid 4% per year to borrow money. Let's calculate how much wealth this transfers. If the government has $38 trillion in debt outstanding, and the average real interest rate is negative 4%, that's $1.5 trillion per year in wealth being transferred from creditors to the government, and this happens every single year that real rates stay negative. Over a decade, that's $15 trillion erased, and this requires no vote, no legislation. It just happens automatically as long as the Fed keeps nominal rates below inflation. Now you might ask, who are these creditors losing $1.5 trillion per year? And the answer is pension funds holding bonds for retirees, insurance companies holding bonds to back insurance policies, foreign governments holding treasury bonds as reserves, and regular people who bought bonds or have savings accounts. All of them are being systematically robbed through negative real interest rates, and they can't do anything about it because the alternative is not holding dollars at all. And for most institutions and individuals, that's not practical. You can't run a pension fund in Bitcoin or gold. Regulations require you to hold a certain percentage in government bonds, so you're forced to accept negative real returns, which means you're forced to transfer your wealth to the government to help erase their debt. Let me show you the historical precedent for exactly what the US is doing now, because this isn't the first time a country has erased massive debt through inflation and financial repression. It happened in the United States from 1945 to 1980, and understanding that period reveals the playbook being used today. At the end of World War II in 1945, US government debt was 120% of GDP, the highest it had ever been, and everyone assumed the government would have to raise taxes dramatically or cut spending dramatically to pay down this debt. But neither happened. Instead, the government kept interest rates artificially low. The Fed pegged Treasury yields at 2.5%, even while inflation ran higher. This created negative real interest rates for bondholders. Meanwhile, the economy grew, and inflation averaged around 4% per year. And by 1974, the debt-to-GDP ratio had fallen from 120% to just 30%. The debt was erased, not by paying it back, but by inflating it away. During this period, anyone who held bonds or kept money in savings accounts lost purchasing power every year. The wealth was transferred from savers to the government and to borrowers who had fixed-rate debt. Homeowners with mortgages benefited enormously because they borrowed money when dollars were valuable and paid it back with inflated dollars. But retirees on fixed incomes got destroyed because their pensions bought less every year. The same mechanism is being deployed now. Current U.S. debt is 136% of GDP, which is higher than the post-World War II peak. The Fed has created trillions of new dollars through quantitative easing. Just like they kept rates artificially low in the 1940s and 50s, inflation has been running well above the Fed's stated 2% target, and real interest rates have been negative for most of the past 15 years, meaning the debt erasure is already happening. We're living through it right now, and if history is any guide, this will continue for at least another decade, maybe two, until the debt-to-GDP ratio falls back to manageable levels, around 60 or 70%. Here are the three groups of people who lose money when the government erases debt through inflation and financial repression, and why understanding which group you're in determines your entire financial future. Group 1 is savers and bondholders. If you have money in a savings account earning 1% interest while inflation is 5%, you're losing 4% per year. If you own Treasury, bonds or corporate bonds that pay 3%, while inflation is 6%, you're losing 3% per year, and this loss is guaranteed and unavoidable as long as you hold these assets. Over 20 years, this will cut your purchasing power in half. Your account balance might stay the same or even grow nominally, but what that money can buy will be destroyed, and this group includes most middle-class Americans who save money in bank accounts or own bonds through retirement accounts. You're being systematically robbed to erase government debt. Group 2 is people on fixed incomes. If you're retired and receiving a pension that pays $50,000 per year, and that pension payment doesn't increase with inflation, then every year your $50,000 buys less. If inflation averages 4% over 20 years, your $50,000 will have the purchasing power of $22,000 in today's terms. You'll be living in poverty despite receiving the same nominal payment. And this group includes Social Security recipients. If benefits don't keep up with real inflation, retirees with annuities, and anyone living off investment income from bonds, the government's debt erasure destroys your standard of living slowly over decades. Group 3 is foreign creditors. Countries like China and Japan hold trillions in U.S. Treasury bonds as part of their foreign exchange reserves. When the U.S. inflates away the debt, those countries lose purchasing power, just like domestic bondholders. China holds about $1 trillion in treasuries. If the real value of those bonds is inflated away at 4% per year, China loses $40 billion per year. Over a decade, that's $400 billion, and there's nothing they can do about it except stop buying new bonds, which they've already started doing. But they can't sell the bonds they already hold without crashing the market and destroying the remaining value, so they're locked in to being slowly robbed. These three groups, savers and bondholders and people on fixed incomes and foreign creditors, are all transferring wealth to one group, borrowers with fixed-rate debt denominated in dollars. This includes the U.S. government itself, which is the biggest beneficiary, but also homeowners with mortgages, corporations with bonds outstanding, and anyone who borrowed money at fixed rates. If you borrowed $500,000 for a house at 3% interest and inflation runs at 6%, your debt is being erased. At 3% per year in real terms, you're being paid to borrow. Here's how you can verify that debt erasure through inflation is happening right now, because there are specific data points you can track that prove this isn't theory, but observable reality. First, track the real interest rate on Treasury bonds. Take the 10-year Treasury yield, which you can find on any financial website, and subtract the inflation rate as measured by CPI. If the result is negative, that means bondholders are losing money in real terms. For most of the period from 2008 to 2022, Real rates were negative, and even now with rates higher, they're barely positive, meaning bondholders are earning almost nothing after inflation. Second, track the debt to GDP ratio over time. If debt is being erased through economic growth and inflation, the ratio should be falling. You can find this data from the Federal Reserve or Treasury. Watch whether the ratio trends downward over the next decade. If it does, that proves the mechanism is working. Third, track M2 money supply. This measures the total amount of dollars in existence, including cash and bank deposits and money market funds. The Fed publishes this data. If M2 is growing faster than the economy is growing in real terms, that's evidence of money creation that will eventually cause inflation. Between 2008 and 2022, M2 increased from 8 trillion to 21 trillion, 163% increase, while real GDP grew only about 30%. That gap is inflation waiting to happen. Fourth, compare official inflation statistics to your personal experience of price increases. If you notice that groceries and housing and healthcare and education are rising faster than the CPI suggests, that's because CPI is designed to understate real inflation. The government has incentive to report low inflation because Social Security and many government benefits are indexed to CPI. If real inflation is higher than reported inflation, then real interest rates are even more negative than they appear, meaning the wealth transfer is even larger. If you track these four metrics, and they show what I've described, negative real rates and growing money supply and debt to GDP falling, and real inflation higher than reported, then you're watching debt erasure happen in real time. Here are the arguments defenders make for why erasing debt through inflation is actually good policy, and why every single argument is dishonest or ignorant. They'll say that inflation helps the economy by encouraging spending. If people expect prices to rise, they'll buy things now rather than wait, and this consumption drives economic growth. But this argument ignores that inflation also destroys savings and makes long-term planning impossible. If you can't predict what money will be worth in 10 years, you can't save for retirement or start a business or make any decision that depends on future purchasing power. So any short-term consumption boost comes at the cost of long-term economic destruction. They'll say the debt has to be dealt with somehow, and inflation is better than default or massive tax increases. And there's partial truth here. If the only options are explicit default, which would crash the global financial system, or doubling income taxes, which would cause a depression, or inflating the debt away, which hurts savers but keeps the system functioning, then inflation might be the least bad option. But this argument assumes the debt had to get to 38 trillion in the first place, and it ignores that there's a fourth option, which is don't accumulate unpayable debt to begin with. They'll say savers are being compensated through economic growth. Even if your savings lose purchasing power to inflation, the economy is growing, which creates opportunities and raises wages. But this only works if your wages actually keep up with inflation, and for most people they don't. Real wages for median workers have been stagnant for 40 years. Even while official inflation numbers are low, if real inflation is higher than reported, then real wages have been falling, and economic growth goes primarily to asset owners, not wage earners. They'll say foreign creditors like China knew the risks when they bought US bonds, and it's their fault if they lose money to inflation. But this ignores that the dollar's role as global reserve currency creates artificial demand for US bonds. Countries need dollars for international trade and energy purchases, so they're somewhat forced to hold treasuries, and the US is abusing this privileged position by inflating away their holdings. The final lesson about how the US is erasing 38 trillion in debt is that this mechanism, inflation plus financial repression, is the only politically feasible way to deal with unpayable debt, and therefore it will continue until either the debt is reduced to manageable levels or the dollar loses its reserve currency status. The government will not pay back the debt through surpluses. The last time the US ran a sustained surplus was the late 1990s, and even that was due to accounting tricks with Social Security. There's no political will to cut spending or raise taxes enough to run real surpluses. Both parties want to spend more. Republicans on defense and tax cuts, Democrats on social programs. Neither wants to be the party that imposed austerity. The government will not explicitly default. That would destroy the dollar's reserve status and crash the global financial system, its mutually assured destruction. so it won't happen except in a complete collapse scenario. Therefore, the only option is to inflate the debt away slowly over decades, keep nominal interest rates slightly below inflation so bondholders lose money in real terms, let the economy grow in nominal terms so the debt becomes smaller relative to GDP, and wait. This requires no votes, no approval. It happens automatically as long as the Fed and Treasury coordinate, and it can continue indefinitely as long as inflation doesn't get so high that it becomes politically unsustainable. The danger point is when inflation gets high enough that voters demand action. If inflation stays at 7 or 8% for years, people notice, prices double every decade, riots start, politicians get voted out. At that point, the Fed might be forced to actually fight inflation by raising rates high enough to cause a recession, and that would make the debt unsustainable because the government couldn't afford the interest payments. So the Fed will try to keep inflation at a sweet spot, high enough to erode debt quickly, around 4 to 6%, but not so high that it causes political crisis, above 8 or 9%. If you understand this, you can predict Fed policy. They'll claim to be targeting 2% inflation. They'll periodically raise rates to show they're fighting inflation, but they'll never raise rates enough to actually bring inflation back to 2% sustainably, because doing so would make the debt unpayable. Instead, they'll keep real rates slightly negative or barely positive, allowing inflation to run at 4 to 5%, and they'll do this for the next 10 to 20 years until the debt-to-GDP ratio falls back under 70%. Now you understand exactly how the US government is erasing $38 trillion in debt without paying it back or defaulting, through inflation that destroys the purchasing power of the dollar combined with financial repression that forces savers to accept returns below inflation. And you understand that this mechanism requires no vote in Congress and no approval from creditors. It happens automatically as long as the Federal Reserve creates enough money to keep interest rates below inflation. And you understand who loses from this process: savers holding cash or bonds, retirees on fixed incomes, and foreign creditors holding treasuries, all of whom are being slowly robbed to transfer wealth to borrowers, including the government itself. And you understand that this isn't a temporary phenomenon, but a deliberate multi-decade policy that will continue until the debt burden is reduced from 136% of GDP to 70%, which at current rates of inflation and growth will take 15 to 20 years. And you understand the historical precedent from 1945 to 1980, when the US used exactly this mechanism to erase World War II debt. And you understand how to verify this is happening by tracking real interest rates and debt to GDP and money supply growth. And most importantly, you understand that there's no political alternative to this policy. The debt cannot be paid back through surpluses and will not be defaulted on explicitly. So inflation is the only option, which means this will continue, regardless of which party controls government or what the Fed says publicly about fighting inflation. If this explanation of how $38 trillion in debt is being quietly erased has made you realize that inflation is not random, but is the deliberate solution to an unpayable debt problem, that your savings and bonds and fixed income are being systematically destroyed to solve a crisis you didn't create, and that understanding this mechanism is essential to protecting your wealth over the next decade, then you must subscribe to this channel immediately, because this is the kind of analysis that will never appear in mainstream financial media. Most channels are sponsored by banks and financial institutions that benefit from you not understanding how money works, and mainstream economists pretend that inflation is something the Fed fights against rather than uses as a tool. But this channel tells you the truth about how the system actually operates, so click that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and understand that subscribing isn't just about staying informed. It's about joining a community of people who refuse to be victims of monetary manipulation. Every subscriber helps this channel grow and reach more people who need to understand these mechanisms. And the more people who understand how debt is being erased through inflation, the harder it becomes for the government to do it without political consequences. Knowledge is power, and spreading this knowledge is how we fight back, so subscribe now. Share this video with anyone who has savings or retirement accounts or holds bonds, because they need to know what's being done to their money, and help us build a movement of people who understand the game being played and are positioning themselves on the winning side instead of being slowly robbed.